Last time on the Salty Siren.
We are covering naval doctrine and tactics throughout the ages. The galley, for those unaware, is a sort of long, usually lightened ship. They often had like a few sails, but like 100% of the time had a shitload of oars, bombarding with arrows and sort of like light ranged weapons that they had at the time, boarding actions, sub-era, which I have titled Ram Ranch, because otherwise known as about 8th century BC. It's now time for the eastern half of the Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, to just rule the fucking seas for the next, like, pretty much 1500 years. They formed sort of like a crescent moon shape with the points sort of facing towards the enemy. The discovery of the New World was really the sort of death knell of the light sort of sailing or oar-based combat ship. Because also at this point, the ships just got too goddamn heavy to move by oar. The other major change from sort of the previous main or like galley times is that with the shortening, tallning, and fattening of vessels, there came to be a huge focus on like batteries of cannons lining each side of the ship. You should have been taught about the Merrimack and the Monitor during the Civil War.
Yeah, old Ironsides.
But pretty much overnight, everyone realized that every single ship they had in their navy could not beat the Dreadnought if they were all thrown at it at once. So that just sort of ends that era of steam naval warfare.
O'er the wild windy sea, I can hear her calling to me. So let's heave away, haul away, and fill our eyes with the shore. Calls to friends, ale and light, and a tale to brighten the night. So heave away, haul away, and heed the siren song.
And at this point, we get to the First World War. Officially the 1900s, officially things that you've probably seen in museums or on TV or in a movie at some point. This was really the point where tactics started getting increasingly complex. The introduction of seaborne mines, torpedoes becoming much more reliable and stable, and the sort of main adoption of submarines really just ramped up the complexity. But despite all of this, the just straight up big old gun remained the most important part of a naval arsenal. So, again, you get very interesting sort of design decisions. Like, for instance, the Russians built one particular dreadnought of those times where it, for some godforsaken reason, did not occur to them that if they put the cannon turrets directly on top, they could rotate them, like, and fire off of both sides. So it effectively had a shitload of like main battery turrets, but it was because there were 3 sets on each side that could not turn more than 180 degrees.
Oh, I think you showed me a picture of this boat.
It's
It's like, what the fuck were they thinking?
it's pretty goddamn goofy. But Germany at the time also had, I think, like one of their, oh, the name's escaping me. But one of theirs that had kind of a strange turret traversal and things like that. But it's this era of warships that I probably know the most about, so I'm struggling not to get sidetracked. But
Stay on target.
stay on target. But still, this sort of led to, with like turrets in general and sort of like traversal ranges, traversal speeds, gone were the days of broadsides, and very quickly they realized that ships that were able to operate their guns at as steep of an angle as possible had a distinct advantage. Because if you took naval guns of those days, the primary way that they dealt damage was through armor-piercing ammunition to other warships of their caliber. Now, you know, I'm sure people have heard of like full metal jackets and stuff like that that's meant to sort of punch through armor. But this is a little bit more complicated and kind of fascinating, because what they discovered was that, you know, the outside of these dreadnoughts are now incredibly difficult to damage. They're like steel, thick steel plates. So what they needed to do was damage the insides, where all the crew were, where all the vulnerable systems and machinery was. And so they needed the rounds to penetrate the armor. But they wouldn't be able to do enough damage by doing the old-timey sailing ship tactic of just sending a steel ball through the wall. They needed some sort of additional effect. And enter, like, main battleship armor-piercing rounds. They effectively had, like, a pressure gauge and a shitload of explosives inside them, specifically designed so that they would punch through the ship. The stress of punching through the first layer of armor would prime the explosives. There was a slight delay so that the shell traveled further into the ship, and then the explosives went off. So it was an incredibly hard balancing game of how sort of sensitive to make your priming charge, because if said charge was too sensitive and it hit too thick of armor for how powerful and how large the shell was, the shell would fail to penetrate and either explode outside the ship, doing basically no harm, or clatter off harmlessly into the ocean. The other option is if you made the sort of sensor too too dulled, then it would punch through one side and not arm, and so just kind of act as ye old cannonball. You know, it might like punch through a dude's chest or something, but other than that, it's not going to deal a lot of damage. Or if it was fired against a ship that just didn't have thick enough armor to prime the detonator, it would just punch through one side and punch out the other, achieving basically the same effect. So you needed to hit this sweet spot of firing it at the right target for the rounds that you had loaded, for the size of gun that you had. And that really drastically changed things, because now these dreadnoughts are sailing with support fleets, smaller sort of like cruisers, destroyers, things of that nature to deal with the other small ships, fend off torpedo boats, things of that nature, clear mines, kind of like the Calypso.
Yeah.
But in general, these ships were now fully functioning, almost cities worth of people, and each one of them could take and deal out an astounding amount of punishment. And also, their targets weren't limited to other ships or like directly coastal batteries now. With the advent of World War I and huge advances in firearms technology, including artillery, that meant that ships could now fire shells at towns several miles inland and sort of lay siege to entire coastlines. On top of that, you started to see the advent of sort of secondary gun batteries, a re-edition of smaller guns. Kind of, wait, we fucked up. We shouldn't have just said fuck the small guns. And so battleships were better able to defend themselves against sort of smaller targets, and it wasn't kind of like big battleship fights big battleship. The other part that I will mention, because it is quite important in how a lot of these dreadnoughts were ultimately destroyed, is now, with the sort of advent of steel, they needed to save as much space as possible, because steel was, of course, very expensive to procure in large quantities, especially of that thickness and of that quality required for dreadnoughts. And so, between that and construction limits of the time, they couldn't just make as big of a ship as they wanted. So every little bit of space counted. And for that reason, they didn't really have shells stored as like brass casing, actual warhead, and, sort of primer and all of that within the brass casing. They had the warhead separate, or the shell separate from the propellant, separate from the primer, and all of this was stored in a section known as the Citadel, as far below the waterline as was possible. And this was usually where all of the important parts of the ship were kept, so that in the event that they did get penetrated by an enemy shell that then detonated inside, it still wouldn't hurt this, like, extra armored, basically gigantic powder keg. But this comes into play later down the line when we move on to the Second World War. And this part, strangely enough for me, we will kind of gloss over somewhat, because I think that this specifically could kind of have its own episode, because at this point, technology's become so advanced, naval construction has advanced alongside it, and now nations are able to adopt entirely different military tactics that counter each other. The design philosophy changes alongside it. But the last sort of note for the First World War is that the magnetic mine really comes into its own. With these dreadnoughts and with the stupid amount of power that you can pack into a mine, that proved to be one of the main ways to sort of deal with dreadnought-class ships. But with the Second World War, obviously the largest change in things was aircraft. So with World War II, the major thing that was added/changed is the addition of aircraft carriers. And so aircraft carriers really obviously changed the game. Aircraft being able to be deployed sort of mid-engagement in the middle of an ocean really allowed for or caused a significant amount of issues for these mainline battleships. Because pretty much no matter how good their suite of anti-aircraft weaponry was, they couldn't really defend themselves against relentless waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes. But there's also a major impact through submarines, which, again, I feel this could probably be its own episode, but particularly the German submarines that were an upgraded version of their cousins from sort of World War I and the interwar years, the U-boat. Surprise attacks via torpedoes from these pretty fast-moving submarines really played havoc on supply lines, made it difficult for entire armored convoys to conduct their business, and it even caused problems for larger vessels. But,
just made naval warfare more terrifying in general.
Yes, because you never knew when a enemy submarine could be lurking close by. Well, that was the destroyer's job at one point, was to kind of use depth charges and really just Elron the shit out of them if they could.
Yeah, now we move into the next era of naval history, which was started by L. Ron Hubbard destroying all the submarines of the world.
We just boiled the oceans away, pretty much. But really, that sort of submarine warfare, the development of anti-submarine warfare to counter it, and the introduction of aircraft carriers in a major way, really changed up how warfare was fought. And it was clear after the Battle of Midway that battleships were no longer the deciding force in a battle. So finally, we come to modern day. Now, modern day is interesting in and of its own right. The aircraft carrier is still incredibly powerful, incredibly impactful. Last time I looked, the US has 14 of them.
Okay.
Which is, I believe, more than the whole rest of the world combined. But aircraft carriers are still incredibly important because the planes that we store on them have only gotten more advanced. So as long as planes still matter and still need at least somewhat of a runway to take off, I don't think the aircraft carrier is going anywhere. We do get...
Yeah, they do have the fancy fighter jets that can take off just from a standstill now.
Right. No, I think the Harrier still sees service in some places across the globe, but I know the U.S. is really, really pushing hard to get that F-35 program to the point where it's up and running. But yeah, in general, just the ability to deploy an entire Air Force's worth of planes from what are effectively moving cities that are now nuclear powered, it's insanely powerful and really allows the US or any nation with significant aircraft carrier presence to dominate the seas, skies, and even a significant area of nations that their aircraft carriers are parked outside of. They're just such a threat in and of themselves just by existing in the proximity to something. But there really haven't been a ton of sort of major conflicts where navies have gone against navies in quite a while. The really most major one that I know my dad really liked to research, partially because it was happening when he was growing up, the Falklands War of 1982 was really the most significant naval fighting since the World War II era. And it's not quite like Operation Desert Storm in terms of like how one-sided it was, but it's close.
Yeah.
Where basically the Argentinian forces seized the Falklands, which were traditionally held by the British Empire and were considered, I believe, a colony at the time. And the whole might of the British military descended upon the significantly more outdated Argentinian military and won pretty handily.
Yeah.
But
they're still not happy about it.
Oh, definitely not. But the last piece that I'll touch on is the advent of the nuclear submarine as well as the missile cruiser. And one teensy little bit of a potential glimpse into the future, maybe, probably not, of the USS Zumwalt. But in short, with the advent of aircraft carriers and their just dominance of a huge sphere surrounding them, we also saw missile cruisers, where now missile technology has evolved to such a point that they can strike targets infinitely further away than an old sort of artillery-style battleship ever could. Just by sitting super far away and launching missiles at whatever the problem is.
And within like a square inch of space.
Right. It's so compact, they're able to just direct and utilize such a huge amount of force onto such a small area that there's really no point in building big ships anymore. Not only are they a bigger target, but you don't really get more power out of it. And you're just sort of putting all of your eggs in one basket. So missile cruisers are a huge part of the US's current naval forces and the naval forces around the world. Nuclear submarines kind of serve much the same purpose. Throughout the Cold War, they were used as kind of a constant threat, much like the submarines were through World War II. You could never be sure when one of them was close enough to your nation to launch nukes at it if you did something bad. And they're nuclear powered, so they never have to refuel. I think the first one that we ever put to sea is still in service, has not refueled, and will not need to for another, I think it's like 45 years.
Nice.
So, really just with nuclear power as well and fuel sources becoming practically infinite if the ship is important enough or big enough, that combined with just the general power of missile systems and aircraft carriers means that brawling days are over, ramming days are sadly 100% over, never coming back, and it's the era of the fighter jet and the long-range missile system.
Those dudes on the nuclear submarines are like 68 now. They say, can we go now?
It has come
say,
into
nope,
port.
45 more years.
Nope. You can only leave when the nuclear fuel runs out. But no, I don't know. I would never want to work on a submarine under like any circumstances.
No. Hell no.
God. For those of you in the U.S. and kind of located in the Midwest, such as we are, Chicago is probably very close to you, and they have, I believe, the only surviving U-boat in existence.
Really?
Yes, it is completely intact. Still got her war wounds on her, but yeah, it was the only one that was ever actually captured. They hauled it back to port, and the U.S. Navy was actually going to use it for target practice, and somebody was like, hold on. I think this is like the only one of these. Let's hold on to it. And they basically built a whole wing of the museum around it.
Nice.
But it's super cool.
I'm assuming L. Ron Hubbard captured it.
Oh, yeah. He won every single battle of World War II, didn't you know?
Oh, I forgot.
But no, it's a super interesting thing to go see. History behind how it was captured is fascinating. And yeah, support your local museums. But on to the final tidbit of this whopping 2-parter episode. We have the USS Zumwalt, which is the first vessel of its kind which can fire railguns. It has railguns, confirmed working railguns, although I don't know if they're ever going to be a thing.
It does work. That's confirmed.
It does work. Like, it is a full, like, military-scale, destroyer-sized cannon railgun. And I didn't write down the exact amount. I really should have.
And a railgun, for people who don't know, and on my limited knowledge, is basically a giant electromagnet that spins and rotates so fast that it hurls a projectile at ungodly distances. And it's very expensive and very complicated to work out.
Yeah, it's effectively a gun, but it's a gun that works off of magnets instead of gunpowder or propellant. The idea being that it's much cheaper to maintain a gun that doesn't constantly subject itself to explosions, but in practice, that is not the case at all. And that is pretty much what happened with the USS Zumwalt. There were supposed to be 24 of them built. I believe currently... So, let's see. What the hell is it? I believe they built 3 of them. Quote-unquote built. I think the Zumwalt is the only one that's done. The other 2 are, like, in permanent limbo because they waited until relatively late in the project to inform them that it was going to cost, basically, like, $1 million per bullet. And the project itself, for the research and like design work that went into the Zumwalt, and for the construction of the Zumwalt itself, let's see. So USS Zumwalt cost. So the construction of the Zumwalt cost $4.4 billion. And
Ooh.
the research for the program, so sort of designing, building, all of that stuff, currently sits at $22.5 billion.
Yeah.
The other cool feature of them, though, is that they are stealth destroyers. They're really weird looking if you get a chance to look up a picture. But that whole reason is to sort of confound radar and tracking systems and hopefully kind of make them harder to locate. But the railguns on them are mega expensive to maintain, infinitely more than conventional weapons, infinitely expensive to fire, and supposedly a lot of the systems installed on them aren't doing so hot. So she's in a bit of a tough spot at the moment, and we're not sure if the Zumwalt really is the future. With that, we are up to date. Not only have we covered the beginning of naval warfare, but we have also covered modern day and potential future routes we may go. Jack, what are your thoughts now that you have been enlightened?
Very, very interesting. I did want to discuss Raft Wars. I think we kind of glazed over that.
Raft Wars?
Do you remember that game?
No. I have no idea what you're talking about.
It's like a really dumb Flash game, and
I'm Googling this shit. Hold on.
You might recognize it if you see it. It's like some bullies steal your little brother's something, and you go and fight them by shooting tennis balls at each other in little rafts.
I've never seen that in my life. I'm looking at it now. It's like a Flash game?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think an important part of naval history and military tactic.
Tennis ball based ammunition. I mean, like early World War I artillery shells just have a tennis ball in the tip. If the tennis ball gets squished, it explodes.
It's the perfect resistance and consistency.
Oh yeah. But no, it was super interesting to me in particular to read about like the galley days. Just because of like how insane some of the stuff was, that like the Byzantines were just like, damn, what if we just made flamethrowers? I
also like how ramming just keeps checking in every once in a while.
That just
throughout history.
Steamships came back and suddenly ramming returned. Which
maybe the US will come out with a ship that can travel at 400 knots and it just cleaves other ships in half.
Yeah, it's just like a steel wedge the size of a destroyer that can travel at like speedboat speeds.
Yeah.
Oh man. No, I do think to some extent, like really at some point, like drones or something with like armaments is gonna have to come into play. But now just like technology is so advanced on like the modern stuff that like there's a whole system that the US installs on like some of its warships where it's able to basically generate its own radar signature, which like covers its own and projects its radar signature as like being nearby but not in its actual place. So any sort of systems that track like a radar signature, anything like that, will just like plunge into the ocean.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really, really crazy stuff. Like, over the span of recorded history, we went from you and your pals throwing a grappling hook into like the next dude's netting and just yanking him out of his fucking boat to like guided missile systems launched from a nuclear powered submarine hitting targets like 3 countries away.
And then I saw some article about this new missile that can pierce the. I know cars aren't armored usually.
Oh, the fucking knife missile.
Yeah, the knife missile. It can penetrate a car and kill a single occupant, but not the other ones.
Yeah.
We are living in Blade Runner.
Yeah, it's so insane, but like at the same time, props. Like I'm happy that we can take out the person that we need to without also like leveling a city block.
Yeah, a city block. Yeah.
And like that's I don't know. That is just so I hesitate to call it sick, but like it's just good that like no longer will the United States be known for just like, yeah, we had to kill a terrorist, sorry, we like just bombed a like civilian area. Now we can just hit him with a knife that's as big as a missile.
I mean, imagine you're an enemy of the United States and your FBI agent just calls you on the phone. He's like, hey, check this out. And then a knife, a giant supersonic knife flies through your house and into you.
Like, that shit's just insane.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I don't know if I've mentioned this in past episodes, but, and I know I've mentioned it to you, but my grandpa fought in World War II, and he was always really impressed by sort of the, like, advances in military technology. Because he was like, yeah, you know, in World War II, we would, like, level an entire city to make sure that we blew up, like, a ball-bearing manufacturing plant in the middle of it. Like,
yeah,
that's just kind of like what they had to do. And of course, like, there's the whole thing that's not naval related, so we probably won't get into it, but like American versus European bombing doctrine during World War II, that Americans bombed during the day because they wanted to make sure they were hitting their targets, even if it meant more pilot losses. And the UK said, fuck that, the Germans already did it to us, and just bombed everything during the night. But
cowabunga it is.
Cowabunga indeed. But at some point he mentioned something to my dad that was like, yeah, back in the day we'd have to blow up a whole city to get to a single factory, and now I could pick which window I wanted the missile to go through.
Right.
Like, it's just absolutely insane. But with that, what's something you've been doing outside of the world of boat history?
Let's see. I'm a big fan of Top Gear for all my Top Gear stans in the audience. I just listened to an automotive history podcast sometimes called Past Gas, which is really good. It's made by the guys at Donut Media, and they did an episode recently on Jeremy Clarkson. And Jeremy Clarkson is just such a douchebag. He's just a total jerk, but he is so amazing at his job, and that is presenting about cars.
Right.
And he's also done a lot of history specials too, which apparently those are really good as well.
Yeah, I remember watching some of those with my dad back in the day. Usually with my mom being like, can we watch something else? And us being like, no, in unison.
Yeah. That's funny. But yeah, he's an interesting story, an interesting person, to say the least.
Yeah. No, character deep dives such as our own on good old Elron are always interesting to listen to.
Right. And how about you?
Well, I have been addicted to this game I found on Steam recently. Let me pull it up. If it will let me. So, it's called Vampire Survivors. I don't know if I ever told you about this game, Jack. At least when I bought it, like, back in the day and kind of forgot about it, it was $3.
Okay.
And it is so good. It is so good to, like, brain off Unga Bunga, like, just return to caveman type shit. Because literally all it is like a top-down Castlevania style, like, survival thing, but like literally the only thing you can do is walk. Your attacks just happen automatically, and just enemies come at you from all sides. It's like 8-bit, very arcade like, but there's like a bunch of different items, and it's generally just, I guess, kind of a roguelike in that like the mix of items that you get is different each time, but you're basically just walking around and like spitting out like axes and like whip strikes and stuff. And it's so dumb, but for $3, I have put like over 20 hours into it already, and it's still super fun. So check out Vampire Survivors if you haven't already. All right.
Well, all right.
Simultaneously. All right. But with that one, Jack, do you want to take us out?
Yes, I'd like to thank Colin Drown at Colin_Drawn for our lovely cover art, and I'd like to thank Joe Koziak for mixing and mastering the intros and outros.
The homies. Support them if you can. Great dudes. As always, thank you so much for listening to the Salty Siren. We'll see you next week.
Bon voyage.
Oh, Johnny, Johnny, call and hear the ancient song of sailors long forgone and sailors still to be. A sweet and solemn tune spoke gently by the tide. Oh, Johnny, Johnny, fall, join the song.